great, so we thank you so much. I'm going to be introducing Avis Berman, and Avis Berman will then be introducing Don Saff and James dePasquale. To give you some background information on Avis, Avis is an independent writer and art historian. She has written extensively on painting, sculpture, photography, design, and museum history. She's the author of Rebels on 8th Street, Juliana Force and the Whitney Museum of American Art, James McNeill Whistler, and Edward Hopper's New York, and co-author and editor of Catherine Kuhn's memoir, My Love Affair with Modern Art. She has also written for Art News, the New York Times, Smithsonian, the Boston Globe, Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, Antiques, Architectural Digest, and Art and Antiques. And she has contributed essays to encyclopedias, anthologies, and museum catalogs on The Armory Show, Roy Lichtenstein, Joan Sloan, Edward Hopper, the Andy Warhol Museum, American Folk Art, Ellsworth Kelly, and many others. Ms. Berman has also sustained a parallel career as an oral historian in the visual arts. To date, she has interviewed over 450 artists, curators, critics, dealers, and collectors, and other significant figures in the art world for such organizations as the Archives of American Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the National Academy of Design, the Mark Rothko Foundation, the Paula Krasner Foundation, the Andy Warhol Museum, and the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation. So without further ado, Avis Berman. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. It's such a beautiful day. I know it's the power of Roy Lichtenstein that dragged you in from all this sunshine, and I think we really appreciate it. And it's my great privilege and honor to be with two people who knew Roy Lichtenstein in the most important way, as an artist, as a boss, as a collaborator, and as a friend. And I'm particularly glad that Don Saff came all the way from Eastern Maryland just to be with us this afternoon, and I'm going to introduce both of them first. James dePasquale is a painter and draftsman, and he was Roy Lichtenstein's chief assistant in his Southampton studio from 1972 to Lichtenstein's death in 1997, and he remains a huge source of help and hands-on information for the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation. He was there with Roy every day out here, and he really knows. In 1980, James first exhibited his work at the Parish Art Museum, where he won the juried grand prize, and since then he's shown extensively in New York City and on the East End, and he's represented in Guildhall's permanent collection. Right now, he has a solo show on view at the Schuken Gallery at 524 West 19th Street in Chelsea. It just opened, and it's terrific, so when you're in town, I urge you to see James's own independent work, which I'm showing you is very different from anything that Roy Lichtenstein did. And then we have Donald J. Saff. Now, where to start with Don? He's an artist, he's an art historian, a master printer, an author, a curator, an engineer, a horologist, the creator and developer of numerous fabrication processes and techniques in the visual art, and he is a polymath of the arts and sciences. He too is also an overflowing resource of memory and information. When I interviewed him for the Lichtenstein Foundation's Oral History Project, he told me he couldn't remember anything, and 2.5 days later, we emerged with one of the most thorough interviews I've ever done for the foundation. Now, from 1968 to 1976 and 1985 to 1989, Don was the founding director of Graphic Studio, which is a workshop at the University of South Florida in Tampa that specialized in collaborative ventures between master artists and inventive technicians, because Don wasn't content with running a conventional printmaking studio. He wanted to make series that had the presence and power of individual unique works, and those works should be technical tours de force if the art and the artist demanded it. He loved creating problems and solving them. And in 1986, Don Saff began working with Roy Lichtenstein. 4 years later, Saff established Saff Tech Arts, which was another facility for the marriage of art and technology, which he moved from Tampa to Oxford, Maryland, which is his base today. Until Saff Tech Arts closed in 1998, he continued collaborating with Lichtenstein, as well as Robert Rauschenberg, James Rosenquist, James Terrell, Jim Dine, and Nancy Graves, among others. And today, Don lives and works in Eastern Maryland and in New York City. And Don's life and career, including all of his collaborations with Roy Lichtenstein, is the subject of an excellent book by the art historian and print scholar Marilyn Kushner. It's titled Donald Saff, Art and Collaboration, and it was published by Prestel Books in 2010. Marilyn did a superb job covering Don's many achievements across artists, media, and continents, and I highly recommend that you seek it out. So anyway, so these are the two distinguished gentlemen that we'll be hearing. And I'm going to start with you, James, because you met Roy first in 1972. So why don't we start with the beginning, which is how did you get your job working for Roy Lichtenstein?
Hi. It was the spring semester of college in 1972. I started attending Southampton College as a part-time art student, and it just so happened Roy just moved out to the Southampton full-time that year, and the assistants who were working with him in Manhattan weren't really ready to move out here, so we called up the college to see if there was a student there who might have a few afternoons available a week who could help him out, do a few things, and I was in the right place at the right time, it seems, and I got the job, and I began working with him in March of 1972.
Well, when you came over to see Roy, what happened?
Well, I kind of knocked on the front door, and he answered it, and I remember he said to me, "Well, you're a little younger than I was expecting, but you're a surfer, and you kind of remind me of my son David, so let's give it a go," type of thing. So that's kind of what happened.
Mm-hmm. And did he look at your work before he hired you?
No, he didn't. One of the main criteria was I was available for at least 3 or 4 afternoons a week, and I had to have a car and a license, type of, which I did. I remember bringing him. I hadn't really done all that much artwork up to then. I was only 19, so I showed him a few things I had done on paper and tempera, and he gave me some canvas. His assistant Richard Dimmler, who was out here showing me how to do things, he helped me make some stretchers, and I started painting on canvas then, and Roy began critiquing my work as I made it, and it was a great way to learn how to paint. I was really fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you kind of give us an idea of what he said when he would see the paintings or anything?
He kind of critiqued you at different levels as you were kind of coming along. Got you to think about how things related to each other on the picture plane, really important to him. Once you kind of got that all figured out, then he started to try to get you to think about coming up with your own voice and something new to say, and not try to look like anyone else, which is a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. You have to make something that doesn't immediately look like art.
Yeah.
Now, what were your first tasks when you first started?
When I first started, there wasn't a whole lot going on. I walked into the studio, and he was just finishing up the barn paintings that he had done. I think it was a small series, and it was one of those in there, and he was just moving into the years he spent doing still lifes. So things hadn't started. I did a lot of stuff around the house, painted bookshelves and things like that. And eventually, I started to stretch the canvas, prime the canvas, underpainted the canvas, watched his working process. Roy did a lot of work with colored paper, collaging colored paper onto his canvases, trying different shapes out in different colors. So that's all part of the assistant work, because it's really easy to have somebody cut out 5 or 6 colors the same shape and then sit there and pin them up and look at them. If he had to do it, it would take him an hour or so. But, you know, he had me to do it, so he could go on doing other things, and then we would stand back and try all these different pieces of collage on the painting that we tried. And eventually he would get the painting. A lot of times the painting was half paper collage and half paint.
And so did you have to mix the paints?
Yeah, he had a standard set of colors that he would always use. And when I first began in 1972, his colors were very basic, pretty much the primary colors. You know, he had, and the secondary colors. The blue was always the same blue. The yellow was always the same yellow. The blue had a little bit of white in it. The yellow had a little bit of green in it. You know, so each color took a couple days really to get just right. We would mix up like a pint or so of color at a time. And so every time a jar would start running out, we'd make a smear on a piece of paper, and we would make a new batch of color. And with these colors, we would also paint white paper. So we had all of his colors, just the way he liked them. All of his colors seemed to work with the other colors. So every color had to be just right, because they just seemed to fall into place in his palette. It was so,
Right.
keep me going.
Yes, it's okay. Great. Yeah, so in other words, these collages, when you cut the paint, they would be the exact color because you had painted his paints on white paper.
Yeah, so a lot of times when there wasn't something to do on the paintings themselves, I would be making collage paper and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Now, how long were you there before you were allowed to touch the paintings?
I pretty much started putting the dots on, with the first month or two. I did it with Richard Dimmler, who was his New York assistant at the time. Mm-hmm. And he was really a generous man. He was really patient and a nice guy. He was maybe 6 years older than I was. He wasn't really that old either,
But yes, he probably seemed like the acme of sophistication to you at the time.
He was, yeah.
So, and then in general, when you matured, what would you be doing on the canvas versus what Roy was doing?
Well, he would always start his canvases from a colored pencil sketch. After I would stretch and prime the canvases, he would come in the evenings, and he'd usually have about, depending on the size of the paintings that we were doing at the time, he would come in the evenings and project these drawings up onto his canvas. He would just sketch them out real quick, and then he would come in for a couple days that week, or maybe take 2 weeks, and he would pretty much redraw everything onto the canvas pretty precisely. And then he would start filling in the colors. Over the years, the approach he took to doing each series of painting kind of changed. When I first started, he even drew the thicknesses of the black lines, and then he would put the colors on, then he would put the black lines on, then we would put the dots or the diagonals on. The more I worked with him, the more he started liking the collage idea. Since he didn't have to do it himself, he kind of went crazy collaging, which is always fun, though. I had to do something. But it was really fascinating to stand back and you have all these different choices, to put them up on the painting with him and to stand back and to see which one he picked and how we would go was really an art lesson in itself.
Well, I'm sure it was very fertilizing, because if you would put all these pieces around and you would see the red next to a color you might not have thought about next to a green or a yellow or an orange, I'm sure that there were also some new color palette schemes came out of that too. I mean, it must have been very fertilizing.
Well, for him, it was, we'd have big folders of colored papers, all different sizes and shapes. Roy always joked we had the largest collection of cartoon brushstrokes in the world, because all these cartoon brushstrokes, they were made out of paper too. I would painstakingly make those, and he would pin them up and look at those. And we would keep all these things. We wouldn't throw them out. A lot of times, if he had a little area that he wanted to try, like maybe a red and black brush stroke. We would go into the pile of colored brush strokes that we had, and we'd pull one out and just kind of pin it up real quick. Even though it didn't quite fit, you would get an idea if it would work or not. So those, and we still have all those.
Yes.
They still exist, these big
Right, there's-
piles of.
They've been preserved.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, in general, what was like a day like at the studio? What was the schedule? What would you start? You know, the sort of a regular day might be.
A regular day, a lot of times I didn't get there till like noon or 1. Roy would usually go in the studio around 10 o'clock, 11, and he would start working. I'd get there, work a little bit, and we'd have lunch. I'd go back into the studio about 1:30 and start working on what had to be done. He'd come in about 2:30 or so after reading the newspaper and things like that. He loved the science section.
Of the New York Times.
Yes. And then we would start working in the afternoons, and usually about 3 o'clock, things really seemed to get cooking. And like the last couple hours into All Things Considered, and that time of day, we really got a lot done. You know, and then we would kind of get to where we wanted to get, and we would just kind of stop there, and he would look at it and come back the next day with some fresh eyes.
So that
And-
was,
and-
it was sort of about 10 to 6 for Roy, and about 11 or
Yeah.
6 for you, or most of it.
You know, with a big, nice lunch hour for him. Yeah. And he'd walk the dog sometimes after lunch. Sometimes he'd go off and play tennis with his friend John Eden. But he really worked pretty much 7 days a week.
Right. Okay, I want to talk about, I hope that you got into the other gallery with the earlier works, and you saw this wonderful, big, black and white sea skyscape. And I just want to talk about that because James was the one who reconstructed this. This was it's called Super Sunset Billboard, and originally it was a 6-panel painting that was created in 1967. And I should say that the original 1967 version, that billboard was painted by a billboard company. So Roy Lichtenstein never painted the first version either. It was his creative design and conception, but he did not execute the intended product. So the only work that Lichtenstein personally made there is that black and white collage to the left of the billboard, which belongs to Joan Crone. And in fact, I think having James make the billboard this time around is closer to Lichtenstein's hand, really, than, really the next best thing than the original sign painters from Philadelphia that would have been, that was made. That original billboard came out of an idea from Audrey Sable and Joan Crone when Sable and Crone lived in the Philadelphia area, and they were active on the contemporary art scene. They were trying to shake things up by organizing, can everybody hear? Yeah, okay. Okay. Right, okay, well, okay, it looks like it stopped. Okay, anyway, these two women were trying to shake things up by organizing several key exhibitions of pop art, and they were backed by the architect Robert Venturi, and all three of them started a campaign to have artists make billboards and have them plant them along the highways as an example of what public art could be. And this idea was squelched by the Philadelphia urban planning establishment, but Roy's Super Sunset Boulevard was made and briefly lived in Philadelphia in Sable's backyard for a few years until the thing disintegrated. So the idea to make another version came about because Dr. Jack Cowart, the Lichtenstein Foundation's director, who conceived of the show here, was thinking about 2 future exhibitions at the same time. One about Roy's Green Street mural, which he did in 1983, which is now on view at the Gagosian Gallery in New York, and this show. And Jack had agreed to have the Green Street mural, which James also worked on in 1983, reconstructed. And since Joan Crone's collage for the billboard was already on the loan list for Guildhall and related to the 60s seascape theme, which is in the other room, he thought it would be great to reconstruct the billboard. And I think it was an inspired suggestion, because it has great wallpaper, wall power. So, Freudian slip there. It's a great wall power. It shows how good the original was, and it relates to the smaller works. It sort of pulls everything toward it. So I should say you can see the Green Street mural at Gagosian at 555 West 24th Street until mid-October. So I am going to ask you, James, about making the billboard. Like, what were you given and what were your instructions?
I don't know how the original guys did it, but I made the billboard the way we would make any large-scale image of Roy's. That pretty much started with the Green Street mural. Roy kind of got into mural painting in the 80s. We did the Green Street mural, we did the Equitable mural, we did 2 giant murals at the Tel Aviv Museum in Israel. We did did I say the Equitable? I think
Yeah.
And then in the 90s, Roy started doing these really large-scale interior paintings, and all of them were made in the mural style. The big paintings we started making like we did with the murals, which was we would take a slide of the image. If the image was really large, we would take it in a couple different sections, and then we would blow it up on the wall. We would trace it all out. I think a lot of times we would use a blue pencil for some reason when we did those. And I think we used a blue pencil that could be washed. And then Roy would lay all the black lines out with black tape, and we would use that black tape to mask out our colored areas. And then we would paint in the color areas, then we would tape around the black lines, and then we pull the black tape off, and then we'd paint the black lines on. So we had this whole system down for making large-scale works. So when it came time for me to do this relatively large billboard there, it was very easy for me. I just got a slide of the collage that was there. Some local friends of mine, the Coral Brothers, they built the panels for me. I gave them the dimensions. They were the same dimensions as the collage, which I had a slide of. So after I got the panels up on the wall, I projected the slide, I traced out the lines real quick, and it was very easy to paint because it's just white and black. I did do a subtle little thing, though. In Roy's paintings, if you look closely at the paintings, the lines, which are painted with Magnicolor, which is a turpentine soluble acrylic, they kind of dry in a semi-gloss, glossy color, and the dots and the diagonals were always done with a oil paint, black, Mars Black, and that always dried very flat. So with this mural, I decided to get some semi-gloss black for the black lines, the cloud and the sea, and for the dots, I used a flat Rust-Oleum. And so it's really 2 colors, but it kind of has like a nice quality that the paintings had.
This is different surface quality.
I'm sure it's better than the original one, but also the original one, the dot pattern was set up on if you look at the collage, the dot pattern was set up on a 45-degree angle, so the dots kind of had a different density. Later on, when I started working with Roy, he had the dots kind of at a 60-degree angle, and it makes them denser and darker. So we had that size dot, which seemed to be perfect for that scale, so that's what I used for that particular problem.
What do you think Roy would have thought of this billboard, your reconstruction?
Oh, I think he would have liked it. Well, he sent me away quite a bit to do projects for him that, they would be made, and he would send me to put the colors on them and to finish them, and he wouldn't see them until the day they left. So it was nice that he trusted me like that. So,
Right.
Yeah.
I think trust is the operative word.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to start asking you some questions now. Yes, thank you. I'll be back to you. Don't relax. At Graphic Studio Don, what were some of the more important projects that you were involved with before you began working with Roy Lichtenstein?
before I began working with Roy. Were there important projects before Roy?
Well, Robert
Yes.
Rauschenberg and Rosenquist.
Yes, wonderful projects with Rosenquist, who really sort of changed the complexion of the studio. What I should say at the outset is that I began the studio in Florida basically because I was lonely. The only thing open in Tampa overnight was the airport and a White Castle. So I had my choice. So the object was, I had never been out of New York except for a year in Italy, and decided that I would try and bring New York down to the university. And what the university had going for it was the range of technology that was available: chemists, physicists, engineers. And if I could convince the art administration to let me hire printers, I could have a situation that no other shop could offer an artist in terms of collaboration. And so that's where it began. And with Rosenquist, who was, in a sense, unfortunately for him, there extended because of an accident, I allowed the shop to just be a sort of open-ended, stay as long as you want, do whatever you want, whatever you say we can do. And we started moving in a direction that began to obliterate the definition of what a print was. I mean, going to school in the 60s and learning printmaking, it was sort of run by the Print Council of America, who told you exactly what a print should be on paper, must be signed in pencil. If you did the printing yourself, you wrote impressite after it. And in the meantime, Warhol was, starting to make prints and stamping his name on the back. Mm-hmm. And they had a static definition for a dynamic process. Well, I was on the bandwagon of trying to obliterate the definition between prints, painting, sculpture. I saw that as artificial, and so the shop was basically dedicated to that. And Rosenquist began applying window shades, a giant hourglass. But I also realized, too, that, that even though he would be painting Hebrew national salamis the length of this room, that for him, printmaking was still a portfolio art. It was still what, publishing that, like Ambrose Vallard did in the 19th century, Picasso's and Matisse's and Degas, whatever, that were small. I mean, print was relatively small, and actually even smaller because someone like Carl Zigrosa, who was a curator at Philadelphia Museum, wrote a book called Multum and Parvo, which is much and little. The emphasis was on, the beauty of a postage-size Holbein, as opposed to something that was expansive. So with the artists like Rosenquist doing that kind of project, and with Rauschenberg questioning even the editioning process. I remember him throwing newspaper on a sheet of paper and sort of coming up with the same layout generally, and we would transfer it. And one of the printers, who was a Tamarind-trained printer and therefore had its sort of draconian understanding of what printmaking was about, said, "But this is not an edition." And Rauschenberg said, "Yes, it is. It's the concept that's the edition. It's not the individual works. They can live and have their own identity." These were important works, and whether they were important aesthetically, conceptually, they were very important, and they opened the way for me to move forward with other artists. A lot of the important works actually never got done. Since we could do anything, I brought Arakawa there. We did a beautiful portfolio, and he said, "Well, you can do anything." He said, "Could you make this object levitate? I need to put it in the work. And if you could figure out something that would defy," and actually I thought about it for a while, and apparently I can't get around Newton on that one. And then Rauschenberg asked me, he said, "Well, you're doing everything. I want to do a dance where there is sparks from one dancer's head to another dancer's head." So off I went to MIT. I had to give like a number of lectures at their media center. in order to work with him and trying to figure out how to get sparks from one person's head to another, and I never did figure it out, nor did they. But, you know, the range of thinking was so healthy, and that didn't happen, something else could happen. Those are some of the projects before.
Exactly, and I think this gives you an idea of why Graphic Studio and what Don wanted to do was so special. Well, however, I should say, starting off, your experiences in beginning to work with Roy were very different than James. Hi, open the door, come on. Why don't you tell when you not met Roy, because you ran into him, you met him about 1980 briefly when he was at Gemini working at Prince, but why don't you talk about your first real encounter with Roy?
That was the first cold shoulder. But I did have LA, so. Roy had a target on his back for me because he was doing some of these large works, and, you know, with other artists, with Jim Dime, I had to convince him to go large. I wanted works to embrace you. You know, we had the smaller works, but I wanted them to invade your space. And in order to accomplish that, I did mock-ups of Dura's Triumphal Arch. I did it full-size. I did a full-size mock-up of Jacopo de Barbari's Venice, and also Titian's Pharaoh's Army being submerged. I had these things all in the ready, and then came a party at Bob Rauschenberg's. It was cheek by jowl. There was a lot of goings on. It was really great. I had asked Rosenquist any number of times whether he could figure out how I could be introduced to Roy, and he said, "Oh, I'll do it, don't worry, I'll take care of it." Well, you know, 2 years later, 3 years later, I still hadn't met Roy. Well, there he was, you know, at this party, and alongside of him was Dorothy, and I got a hold of Jim, and I said, "You said you'd introduce me?" He said, "Absolutely, you know, let me introduce you." So we walked over. It was a non-introduction because, I mean, he introduced me. He said, "Roy, this is Don Saff, you really should work with him." And Roy looked at me and said, "Oh, hello," and turned away, and, you know, this conversation. It was so demoralizing for a second. And with that, Dorothy was standing alongside of him, turned to me and said, "He will work with you." And okay, I went away. You know, is that really going to happen? Then I started the phone calls, you know, I guess you could get arrested for whatever that is, pursuing someone that often, and asked whether I could show him some work. I didn't know what I was going to show him, and he invited me out to a lunch in Southampton. And at the time, I was working on wax. I could do wax better than anybody. Bryce Martin had done some wax prints, but they were thin. I could do an impasto. I could do any color. I could mix it. So I showed it to Jasper, because if you're going to do wax, you know, the chief on caustic guy was Jasper. And he sat, I remember it was on Houston Street, and he sat at the old studio, and he's looking at the sample. Like for 5 minutes, that's a long time. And I said, "What do you think?" He said, "I don't have any ideas." I said, "Okay, can I call you in a while?" He said, "Sure." Well, with that, I had the meeting set with Roy and Dorothy for lunch. I went to Connecticut, Washington Station, Connecticut, to meet with Dine. He said, why are you going to Roy's? I said, "Well, I want to show him this wax thing." And he said, "Let me see it." He said, "I'll do that." I said, "No, I said I was going to show something to Roy, and this is what I'm taking." So I took the wax to him, and he said, "I'm interested." I then went to the studio in New York and saw just what James was talking about. Table full of brushstrokes, you know, brushstrokes on the wall. And I said, "Would you give me a brushstroke so I can do something with this?" He gave me a paper brushstroke.
That was in the Southampton studio. That was in the Southampton studio. I remember that day you came, and he told me, "This guy's coming, and he wants me to do some prints with him." And he really wasn't in the mood to do prints. And he was kind of like, I was surprised how he wasn't being real. And then we ended up giving you some cartoon brushstrokes out of our pile that day.
That's right.
But
Yeah.
I remember giving them
Right,
to you.
you know, and I think that he didn't want to work with me is not atypical. And nobody wants to work with a printer, only because it interrupts the schedule. And in Roy's case, you know, there was a set schedule.
But he did like to work with printers because he would go out to Gemini once a year.
Yeah, but
and
that was
kind of
Venice
thing.
Beach, you know, and he liked Venice, right? I mean, there was a geographical advantage.
Like a
Sure, he liked,
vacation,
once he
right.
was there, right. And he had a history of working with Ken Tyler, but you don't have an interloper come along and screw up the entire schedule.
Right.
Because once a year you go here, the next year you go to Ken, then you go back to L.A. What's this other guy doing, you know?
Exactly.
And he's in Florida, you know, who wants to go to Florida? But you know, but I took the brushstroke and we made a glass brushstroke out of it, a laminated wood brushstroke out of it, a print, something with the wax, you know. And when I brought the wax print with a sort of bad, and I particularly made it bad, really bad Roy small painting, print I should say, and he said, I'll do a print with you. He said, let's do this. And it was already conceived of because that project was going to Gemini. The brushstroke heads were going to Gemini. And I said, and he said, this is going to Gemini. I said, so you're going to take that away? Well, I'll give them something else. And he did the imperfect with Gemini then and did the brushstroke heads and incorporated the wax printing.
Why did you make the print purposely bad? Isn't that counterintuitive?
Because in every case, it's like when I developed fresco for Rauschenberg. I mean, I knew everything about, by the time I was going to show it to him, I knew everything about how to transfer from a digital image to fresco on wet plaster. The thing was fully blown. And yet what I showed him was a rather imperfect version of all of that, and an incomplete one. The thinking being that I didn't want to close off anything. Inevitably, the artist brings so much more to it than you'd anticipate, and the less you give, the more you're likely to get. And so in all cases, when a prototype was made, that's how I'd go about making it, irrespective of how much I knew in terms of doing it.
You wanted to leave it to the artist's imagination.
I wanted to collaborate. You know, and my definition of collaboration is a kind of voyage from the known, you know, these pieces, to the unknown. You have people with common commitment who are both willing to steer and willing to follow. It's really a dance. It could be beautiful, or you could be stepping on each other's toes, and you did both through the whole process.
Yeah. And how do you think that your early projects, the early brushstroke project, meshed with some of the brushstroke paintings prints that are on the wall right now? Not the water lilies that you did, but the other projects he was doing.
Meshed in what way?
Well, I just wondered if you saw a relation, you know, what kind of
Oh
relation.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I didn't see them. Technically, they were lush in terms of the surface, but they weren't a departure for me. They weren't the departure that I wanted. So, frankly, they were wonderful prints, but not the jump I wanted to make, which basically came in the next project when I showed him another test that I made.
Okay. Actually, James, I want to go back to a couple of these early sailboat paintings that you worked on with Roy. Roy had recently finished a couple of big series, the Expressionist paintings and the American Indian paintings. And this seems to be a real swerve away from those works, although he did do a series of paintings with apples in them, in which he did kind of get this cartoon brushstroke that we see again. I just wondered if where you thought some of these sailboat paintings came from.
Where they came from.
Well, or anything else you want to talk about.
Oh, okay. Oh, God, I was thinking. more about what Don was talking about. But
Go ahead.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about those prints that Don did, these expressionist ones. The brushstroke, the cartoon brushstroke element of the print was encaustic, is that correct? There was the encaustic wax.
Some of it was.
Some of it was.
Some of it was. What was interesting is
And
that it was a compilation of, the hardline caricature brushstroke, but then what we did is in the print modulate the brushstroke with wax. Actually, it started with the first earlier print, which was that Carnegie Hall print that we did. But that was, he sort of gave us a start with that, using the process, because he had a commission to do that. I showed him that, and we quickly made that print for Carnegie Hall.
But the whole thing was silkscreen, or was some of it litho too?
It was everything. It was litho, silkscreen, and encaustic wax.
Yeah, it's just all those different techniques to
Right.
make one print is just so mind-boggling. You know, and people don't realize that all these different techniques are used to make one print. A lot of
it's
times I have to
and-
point it out to
And
them.
it came to real fruition with basically the last project that we were working on, and we were working on that when Roy passed, and we had finished the first of that, and that was the brushstroke still lifes, in which I had asked him whether he'd be willing to do some hand painting on the still life, and he said no, and was able eventually to convince him to do that. And so what we had on that was the hardline brushstroke, the modulated brushstroke that was done in printing, and modulated in wax and modulated in lithography, and then the hand painted. So it's the whole gamut from executing the brushstroke. Went through the whole range of things.
This is incredible. Incredible.
I think what we should just say for the audience is that, in the mid-1960s, Roy Lichtenstein made a series of what I would call portraits of brushstrokes. They were abstract expressionist brushstrokes that he blew up. I mean, which was a really radical concept because, of course, the brushstroke is the foundation of Western painting, but no one had ever taken the brushstroke as a subject, and so he hadn't used them for a while. And then in 1980, with these paintings, he really returned to them with a vengeance, and then you begin to see all of these different brushstrokes. I mean, he began using the brushstroke as a building block again, but it's really almost constructing a painting out of brushstrokes. So it really became an element for him that was, really used throughout. I was going to ask you, James, you have talked about how Roy unified these paintings, and you've always talked about drawing within a drawing, and the circular. I wondered if you could get up and show us, on one of these paintings, like the circle, one of Roy's matrix. Maybe this one.
Okay,
or
well, I'll
this one.
talk.
All right.
Roy always started his paintings with just about all the time with a colored pencil sketch. They weren't very large. They were about this big a lot of times. He would do them in the evening a lot when he wasn't in the studio. Sometimes he would bring them in and he would work on them on the drawing cutting table that I would be collaging on, so I got to watch him draw quite a bit, which was always fascinating. But one thing I did notice a lot was Roy would start his drawings, and he always pretty much had a standard size stable of stretchers that he would use. So he had little cards made up of all the perfect dimensions of all the different size canvases that he liked. So he would make a little rectangle in his sketchbook before he would start his drawing. And I noticed a lot of times he would make these little, in graphite pencil, a really light little circle, maybe in one corner over here, and then maybe like kind of a circle over here a little bit. Sometimes they would interlock. And then he would start his drawing on top of that with colored pencil with the image he was thinking of doing. And a lot of times these circles would kind of end up in the colored pencil drawing. It was like a secondary matrix to the image the obvious image that the painting was about. And what this actually did, it kind of unified the paintings. So, the stuff in the background and the foreground, everything was kind of united by these things that related to each other that way. That's the way he kind of did that. And I can maybe show. Well, the water's kind of funny because it reflects, so it's kind of obvious that way.
I thought maybe one of these might be easier or not.
Well, they're kind of obvious because it's water.
Obvious to you.
Well, if you look here, like this is like, it's kind of called locales. So you have like this thing. It's obvious that the water is reflecting the sky. That kind of unifies it. It's easy. It kind of has something over here going on, the way these kind of all kind of end. This kind of comes up into here. He also has something kind of going on in here. So you have this and this, you have this. It all kind of holds the painting together. I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody.
Thank you.
He
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
used that.
Right. Now, I want to make sure, because time is passing, that we start talking about the water lilies print that Don did, which are those two prints over there, the two with the Tonto over there on the right wall there, and then over there on that left wall.
Beautiful
and
one
then-
behind us.
And one behind us. These are the Water Lilies project. So I want to start, Don, how did the Water Lilies project come about?
Well, sort of incrementally, Roy came down when I was still in Florida, and we did the Brushstroke Heads. We went to the Columbia restaurant and in Ybor City, and we sat there looking at these paintings, and they had these very, very Baroque frames. And we were laughing about, the power of the frame over the art, and then started talking about individual works at the Metropolitan, which we thought were overpowered by the frame, and Monet was one of them. And in a sense, he wanted to comment on it. I said, wouldn't it be great to comment on that? So I was up again having lunch in Southampton, and there was no project in the offing, and I didn't know which way to go. We were sort of just finishing the one project. You think of timing, and in any event, this time he helped me, because sitting across the table, I was with my back to the house, and he was sitting there, and Dorothy was next to him. And he said to me, do you know those swirly things that are on, dashboards and early sports cars? Well, I knew that because of, working on chronometers. The back of them have these little spots. It's actually called spotting. That's made with ivory rods, it was at the time, and pumice. And I said, yeah, I know what that's about. And then the conversation went on to something else. Well, I couldn't get out of there fast enough, because I knew if he asked me that question, that's a potential project. He didn't say you want to do a project, no. He just asked me that question. Instead of going to Maryland, I went to DC, went to the Air and Space Museum, bought a book, and right at the cash register, ripped the picture of
The book was about the spirit of St. Louis, because the spirit of St. Louis has all of this cowling on it. In other words, this sort of circular, swirling steel. So he, in other words, that.
Right. So actually, the book was a general book on Air and Space Museum with a good picture of the cowling of the spirit of St. Louis. I ripped it out and asked the cash register lady for an envelope, addressed it and sent it off, and basically just wrote, is this what you mean? And then called him about a week later, and he said, yeah, that's what I mean. He said, can you do that? He said, because I have this idea about doing Monet works, water lilies. He said, you think that would work? I said, sure, we can make that work, of course. And
This is what this is.
and so, you say that, and then started doing experiments, and it took forever, because I tried it on aluminum. I ordered diamond mandrels from Morton Abrasive, and tried everything, and the end result was that one of my printers came up, he cut a piece of leather off of his shoe, put it on a mandrel. We turned the drill press upside down and hung it from the ceiling and put a foot pedal on it. And with glycerin and carborundum, which is what's used for lithostones for grinding that, we could make each individual swirl. So each of these swirls were made individually, and we did it on stainless steel, which reflected the light properly. And no doubt, if Monet was around today, this is exactly what he would have done. Well, we had the Monets. What about the frames we talked about a few years ago? And he said, okay. He said, that's a great idea. Go out and buy enough frames to do this, and I'll make the work to fit. I'll make the work to fit the frames. So I went out and bought that. One was a Venetian frame, which was an oval, and that was the first one. And I had about 15 other antique, really good frames. And I cast that in bronze and put it on the first print, which would be back there. Now, it didn't have the white field around it. It was just the oval. And the frame came out beautifully. I was all excited about it. I put the print in there. I brought it up to New York to show it to Roy. We hung it on an easel, and he looked at it and he said, doesn't work. And and I looked at it, and I could not argue with that. It didn't work. It just crushed the image. And so he rethought that. He ended up putting white around the ovals to give it space and designed his own frames. The frames that I have are still in storage to this day. Someday, I'm sure, find some use for it. But the project went on, and we, like most of the other projects, I didn't want it to be in a print gallery, so we showed it at Leo Castelli's for the opening. It was nice. It was sort of documented by, at the time, CBS Sunday Morning was doing a program on the shop, and they were there at the opening. The only downside, the opening was wonderful. The only downside was that Ellsworth Kelly had done a beautiful blue floor that was too large for the space. He made it too large, sort of like the Imperfect in a way. So you had the edges and all that, and then the water lilies was in the back room. So it looked like the Ellsworth Kelly was the blue water predicate for walking into the water lilies. I can't tell you what he said to me at that opening. I mean, he was furious, and Kelly, right? No, Roy was pretty happy. And I mentioned it to Roy. He didn't seem to be too fazed by it. So that's it. I mean, it was very labor intensive. We went 24 hours a day on swirling. The night shift was a woman fireman or fire lady or whatever, and she would come in and do the night shift, and they called her the night swirler, and her spotting or her swirls were the most accurate, and there was a real touch to it. And every one of these spots are, the whole thing is moved along and registered and with the glycerin on it and swirled, and then the print is put over that, and some of it's masked out by very thin foil. A rather complicated process, and it came out at a time right after the economic decline, and when I put what I thought were the appropriate prices for these virtual paintings on it, they said, no, that's never going to work. Prints will never command that price again, and it was both aesthetically and commercially successful project. I mean, they're remarkable. The fact is, I also asked Roy at the end of that, because inevitably he'd do us prints, and then there would be an adjunct group of paintings that were associated with it. And I said, are you going to do paintings for this? He had already done one small painting that was in a Baroque frame, and he said, no, I can't do anything better than this. I'm not going to do the paintings. And so there is no painting series based on the water lilies.
Just the collages.
Just the collages,
Right,
yeah.
right.
That's the collages, that's our collaboration.
Right. Well, before Don would do a print, Roy would actually make a life-size collage for you guys to cut your screens with and stuff,
Right.
and know where everything was placed. The swirling was represented by the flat side of aluminum foil, and the shiny part was represented by the shiny side of
Oh, right,
aluminum
right,
foil in the
right.
collages. That's the
Right.
kind of way we did those,
Right.
yeah.
Well, it's also very interesting that I think these collages show a real expansion of the palette. Was that because Roy was thinking it was kind of tropical or garden or different?
I think he was looking for a good excuse to use these new pastel colors that he's invented later on in his life. It was kind of they were the perfect vehicle for that.
Now, I realize you're stuck with these frames, but how did you feel about Roy's ability to sort of reject something and say, this isn't working? Was that disturbing?
Well, he did a number of rejections. And inevitably, I thought it was a remarkable characteristic of his working, because in one case, the Imperfect Sculptures, I did the entire edition based on his bookcase in New York, and based on what he wanted. And what he wanted was for these pock marks in it, and I could make perfect sand casting, and he wanted them ruined. You know? And he said, I want it like my bookcase. So I made the whole thing like his bookcase, and it's there, and he says, I don't like that. He said, I said, well, I'll fix it. He said, well, you won't be able to fix it. And finally, he acquiesced and let me get it to where he wanted. But he was willing to pitch the whole thing. In another situation, I had come up with a scrim on which I could put silkscreen silicone and have things levitate, literally levitate. The thing I couldn't do for Arakawa, I could do with the Ben-Day dots. And it was marvelous. And I took that up to show him. It was in the form of one of his mirrors. And he said, it's beautiful, but I don't have an idea for it. And I thought it was dead. I waited 6 months, distraught, because this thing was so beautiful. I was about to offer the idea to Rauschenberg when he called and said, I have an idea for that process, if you're still interested in doing it. And he came up with a suspended mobile. And that was absolutely appropriate for something that was floating. I knew it was appropriate because when we did the first work, the FedEx man came in and he tapped this thing which couldn't move, thinking that it was sculpturally could move. He couldn't see that it was stretched on a scrim. So in answer to your question, it was, he was willing to reject something or make it right. And that's actually, I had not been used to that characteristic in an artist. I don't think I ever went down the road with Rauschenberg or Rosenquist, or even Dine, where they didn't work their way through, and there was never a point at which they rejected something. And sometimes it would have been a good idea if they did.
Okay, well, since I want to leave time for the audience to ask questions, I'm going to ask one more of each of you. And for you, James, I mean, obviously you worked for Roy for 25 years, so you liked your position. But what was Roy like as a boss?
People always say I had the best of Roy. Roy loved to work in the studio, and I was part of the studio. It was like being his third and fourth hand, and he would come in. I never saw Roy lose his temper. I never saw Roy curse. Roy was an exceptional human being, and he was just an amazing artist to work for. And he was so caring and giving, and he was so generous. He and Dorothy are both super generous. That's why I don't know, I'm still around, maybe. But having Roy as someone to critique my work as I grew older, and I think you were the one who said it, that he helped me become a better artist. That made me a better assistant. So that's kind of was a nice thought of yours. Thank you.
Okay. And Don, obviously, we were just talking about Roy's ability to reject something, but I would like to ask you if you would if it's possible, compare working with Roy Lichtenstein versus working with Rauschenberg or Rosenquist or Nancy Graves or any of the other artists, whomever you prefer, and and what they required and went about things versus how Roy approached a project.
They all were demanding equally in their own way. Roy was, to mix those colors, James and I were talking about it beforehand, I don't know there's anything been more difficult in my career than mixing a Roy color. What was different is Roy's personality and his openness. Roy would ask me questions, not about the art. He'd ask me questions about science or whatever was in the news. Or we'd have a conversation. It wasn't always about Roy and his art. There was more give and take than I had with any other artist, and many of them are my friends that have survived and remain my friends. But Roy, the dialogue, I really look forward to those lunches when I went to New York to show him something. It's also, Roy had this incredible sense of humor. And he would play with me regularly. And, I could think of 3 instances. I was desperate to get an answer on a project. And again, waiting and waiting, what's the proper timing? So finally I thought, I'll get him to react. So I did a drawing of a hand thumbs up and a hand thumbs down, and I faxed it to him. I want an answer, And I waited, and a few hours later, I got a response. He sent me a picture of a thumb going this way. So then what do you do? A few hours later, I got another drawing. He let it sit for a while and had a good old time. And I can imagine what he was saying in the studio. Another time, and relative to the water lilies, I came into the studio, and of course, my stock in trade is, you never know where a project's going to go. And no matter how stupid or silly or whatever, it could end up being sublime. So I walk into the studio, and I don't know whether Dorothy was in on it. She seems too nice to do that. But I know Rob McKeever was there, and I think Cassandra and a few people. And I think the collage for Water Lilies with Willows, which is the real long horizontal, had a little frog on it, the water lily. And so I walk in, everybody's working, and Roy says, "Okay, I guess the collage is ready to go. How do you like this? I put this in here." So, what am I supposed to say? It's stupid. It's like, so I said, as I had in other cases, why don't we think about that, and we'll get back to that, in a while. And everybody burst out laughing because, he just set everything up. He knew what I was going to say. I wasn't going to say it's stupid. I wasn't going to say whatever. I was going to defer, and wait it out. And I tried that on other occasions, which, I can go on and on with that. The only other thing I did was I really wanted to do something. I desperately wanted to do something with the Van Gogh bedroom. And so what I contrived is to have a long conversation about dioramas at the Museum of Natural History. Talked about the artist, whatever. My game plan was that I was going to do a diorama of Van Gogh's bedroom. And so I waited a few weeks, and then I did the diorama in paper small. I didn't want to be too aggressive, It looked great. So he looked at it and says, "That's interesting," And I said, "We can do it in this metal." I showed him some samples, and he pinned it up. He pinned it up on the cork board next to the desk. And the next time I came in, the diorama was there, and there was a little cutout of Louis XIV in the diorama. And then the next time I came back, there was a dog in addition to the Louis XIV. And that was his answer. It never became a project. He played, he played with the art. He played with you individually. But he had an empathy, which I have to say, I didn't find in many other people. And when we were in the midst of the last project, Roy passed, I thought, well, I'll try one more artist. I went met with her, left and said, "I've worked with the best, I'm finished." And that was the end. I closed down the shop.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. And there is an addition.
No, it's an addition. Yeah, that's the whole point. The question proves the point. That's what was intended, to basically make a painting accessible to those who couldn't have access to it. And so it operated, it provided a niche for people to aspire to and to have a different experience with an addition work.
How many? What is the addition of these?
I think
They're 23, isn't that?
23, 22 or 23. Are they numbered? Sure, they're numbered. No, that's, that thinking is old. Like that used to be when you had dry point. Numbers were important because the dry point burr would close down. But when you're doing silkscreen or any of these processes, they're not kept in sequence, and they're not necessarily signed in any sequence.
Anybody else have a question? Lana. Are the- Well, thank you. And this lady has worked on commissions with Roy, so she knew him and experienced his work ethic and work processes. So thank you very much, Lana.